That when Jim Carrey's a huge fan of my father's, and when they were doing How the Grinch...
Have you ever met people who are always cheering others up but keep a whole lot of personal battles bottled up? Here in this video, we will be taking you through the life of the legendary Hollywood star Donald Knotts. He was full of great humor, well-known, loved and respected by most people in the world. However, deep within, he had challenges that caused great damage between him and his daughter Karen. What truth has she broken? Let's find out. Public persona versus private pain. Jesse Donald Knotts was born in the year 1924. He was an American actor and comedian, widely known for his role as Deputy Sheriff, The Andy Griffith Show, for which he earned 5 Emmy Awards. Just his name, Don Knotts, brings a smile to your face. Many people knew him as America's favorite funny man. He was that goofy, wide-eyed deputy Barney Fife from The Andy Griffith Show, a character so full of nervous energy and awkward charm that you couldn't even help but laugh every single time he stepped on screen. His iconic voice, rubbery expressions, and that constant jitter made him unforgettable. Don Knotts possessed a very rare kind of comedic magic that made people feel good any time they were around him. It was effortless, and so much a part of him that he didn't even struggle to make it possible. It flows, as is his nature. But that was just one side of the man that was displayed to us all on television. This was the side carefully crafted by scripts, makeup, and studio lights. Behind it all was a man who was far more complex, fragile, and haunted than most people ever think. People thought they knew him, but barely knew this personal part of him. And now, at the age of 71, his daughter, Karen Knotts, is finally ready to share it with the world. She has been quiet about it for years. All the pain, grief, and misery she intentionally kept private. She kept the truth tucked away behind decades of reruns and applause, but she has resolved that the time has finally come for her to speak plainly about what is, just the way it is. She resolved to speak the truth as it is, because no matter how awful it might be, it can also be the most powerful tool one needs for healing. Karen, in a recent heartfelt interview, opened up to say that people always ask her what it was like growing up with Don Knotts as her dad. They expect funny stories as usual, and even the jokes and laughter that keep people entertained. Yes, we had that, she said, but we also had pain, a lot of pain. And for the first time, I want to talk about it. From the outside, Don Knotts had it all. He had fame, awards, money, and admiration. But on the inside, Karen revealed that he was a man in constant battle with himself. He had a lot of struggles that people didn't even know about because he concealed them by putting on a strong, happy, jovial front. He fought a battle that no one saw. Not the fans, not the press, not even some of his closest friends, just his daughter. Karen remembers being a very little girl who was used to watching her dad make the world laugh so much, then come home and fall apart. He was nervous all the time, she says. That shaky, anxious energy you saw on camera, it wasn't even an attempt to add spice to the show. Neither was it an act that was him expressing the anxiety within his soul. He lived in his nerves and in his head, and it exhausted him. Don Knotts suffered from severe anxiety and low self-esteem for most of his life. Karen says he never truly believed he was good enough, or was even up to anything acceptable, even when the world told him otherwise. 5 Emmy Awards and a legendary comedy career was never enough to silence the voice in his head that said, "You're not enough." He'd come home from a shoot or a performance and you could easily tell that he was wiped out, Karen recalls. Not just physically, but emotionally. He'd go straight to his room, close the curtains, and just lie there for hours, thinking and even crying. TV, no lights, it was just darkness. I used to sit by the door wondering what was wrong. But I was a kid, so I had no idea what anxiety or depression was. She pauses for a moment with the weight of the memory settling in. And we didn't talk about those things back then, especially not in a famous household. You put on a smile and played the part. You didn't talk about mental health, you didn't talk about sadness, and you definitely wouldn't talk about it if your dad was Don Knotts. Karen describes her childhood as a strange mix of love and loneliness. Her dad was affectionate in his way, but she didn't feel him. He told her that he loved her, he made her laugh, and all his endearing deeds. But there was always something distant about him and their relationship. True, he was there, but not really there in any sense. He was the kind of dad who'd make me pancakes, play with and spend a bulk of time with me in the morning, then retreat into silence by afternoon, she says. Sometimes he would be funny and playful. Other times he would lock himself in his room, unreachable. As a child, I thought maybe I had done something wrong, but looking back, I realized he was just trying to survive his own mind. Don's childhood, Karen explains, wasn't easy either. He grew up during the Great Depression in West Virginia. His father suffered from schizophrenia and was abusive. Don witnessed violence, instability, and fear from an early age, scars that never truly healed. Karen believes that trauma laid the foundation for his lifelong struggles with anxiety. Don Knotts simply used comedy as a means to escape from the world he was going through. It was like armor to him. He felt that if he could make people laugh, they would not notice the pain, terror, and anxiety that he had hidden for a long while now. And as long as he kept people laughing, maybe his fears and anxieties would not catch up with him. But his hideout didn't work, because it always caught up with him. Loneliness behind laughter. For people like Don Knotts, fans often found it difficult to imagine that he could ever feel sad or lonely, given their perception of him as a social person from afar. He was adored by fans worldwide. The crowds cheered so much for him, and even his colleagues admired him. Studios hired him repeatedly because of his expertise in the entertainment field. From The Andy Griffith Show to Three's Company and beyond, he carved out a legacy as one of television's greatest comedic legends. But behind the scenes, Karen Knotts says her father carried a kind of loneliness that even fame could never fix. He had fans everywhere, she says, but I don't think he ever truly felt known. Karen always broke down whenever she had to say this because it's not an easy thing even to admit. To open up to the world that your very own father, someone that millions would give anything just to meet with, was emotionally unavailable to the people closest to him. But now, she's done hiding. She's no longer keeping it a secret from the world. She has now resolved to let it all out and not die in silence. The emotional distance between Karen and her father is one thing that shaped Karen's childhood. Their home was way too quiet. It is quite normal for kids to be noisy and playful, but Karen's home was unusually quiet due to the unavailability of a playmate. This has made Karen a very reserved and quiet person, and it is even safe to refer to her as an introvert. The house was just too quiet for a house with a world-famous comedian living in it. She says he wasn't cold, not at all. However, there was always something missing, a warmth that didn't quite reach the deepest parts. He was very kind and generous, and yes, he loved his daughter so much. However, the emotional distance was there, and it was quite undeniable. Sometimes cases like this one are even worse than someone being angry or mean for no reason, because in this case, you're only guessing and left in the space of assumptions and constantly wondering if you're loved, if you're seen, or even regarded. Karen shares memories of long stretches of silence between them. Not angry silences per se, just blank spaces where connection should have been, but was neglected. I'd sit at the dinner table across from him and he'd be lost in thought, and his eyes would be somewhere else, like he was watching a movie only he could see. She opened up that moments like this made her feel invisible and not cared for. Like, why would she be in the house with her father but not feel even in the slightest way that she has a father? It felt like she was all alone in the large building of the very famous comedian Don Knotts. She says those moments made her feel invisible. Yet she never blamed him because she saw how much he struggled even to stay afloat. Don Knotts, she explains, was a man battling his demons while putting on a show for the world. It was as if he wore two faces, one for the public, polished, quirky, always on, and one for home, tired, withdrawn, and silently burdened. Karen would recall all the nights that sleep seemed so far from her dad. He would lie awake, looking so keenly at the ceiling, restless, anxious, and agitated. He just worried himself about every single thing. Even the seemingly insignificant things bothered him greatly. He was always restless. He carried this pressure to stay relevant, to stay loved, to keep being funny. And that kind of pressure doesn't just go away when the cameras stop rolling. He wanted people to always see him as a top person. He didn't want to fade for any reason whatsoever. He had a serious fear of fading, and that fear made him break down a whole lot of times. All the relationships he had also reflected that inner restlessness. He couldn't even hide it or pretend to be fine for just a while. Everything kept falling apart because of how weary he always was. He was married 3 times, but each of the marriages crumbled. They all started with high hopes, but none could hold up against the emotional wall he kept around himself. They couldn't even melt his heart or break him to gullibility.
Well, the show talks about my dad's childhood.
He wanted love, Karen says, desperately, but he didn't know how to let it in. He didn't trust that it would last, or maybe he didn't trust that he deserved it. Watching those relationships crumble deeply affected Karen. As a child, she saw the heartbreak. As an adult, she finally understood the patterns. Each time a marriage ended, it felt like I lost a little piece of him. He'd become quieter, more cautious. It was like he believed love just wasn't something he could get right. She also recalls how in moments of vulnerability, he'd joke to mask his pain. He'd say things like, "Guess I'm better off alone," and then force a laugh. But the sadness behind it was real. You could feel it. Karen says she used to lie in bed at night listening to her dad walking around the house in the dark. He couldn't sleep. He'd just pace. Sometimes I'd hear him talking to himself, rehearsing lines or mumbling something I couldn't quite catch. It was like he was trying to quiet the noise in his head, but it never worked. The silence in the house was way too heavy for Karen to bear. It was not even that they didn't love each other, of course they did. But love in their home wasn't loud or obvious. It was buried under years of unspoken pain. Karen silently wished her father would become loving and available for her one day, just one day. She always prayed that his joy would be restored and he would experience an immeasurable level of happiness, but it seemed as though all her prayers went unanswered. Karen recalls one time when she tried to ask her dad what was wrong. She must have been around 12 years old at the time. He found him sitting in the dark, staring at a blank TV screen. I asked if he was okay, and he just smiled and said, "Of course, why wouldn't I be?" However, there were tears in his eyes. She never brought it up again, and he never even explained. That moment, she says, stuck firmly with her. It taught me that asking questions wouldn't get me answers. Maybe he didn't have the words for what he was feeling, or maybe he didn't think anyone would understand. In those days, mental health wasn't even something you could openly talk about, especially not in Hollywood. And it's even worse when your field is making people laugh. Mental illness was a taboo, Karen explains. There was no space for vulnerability. No one wanted to hear that the funny guy was falling apart. So Don did what he always did, and he hid it because he didn't want to appear too vulnerable in the eyes of his fans, right in Hollywood. And Karen, his daughter, learned to do the same. I became really good at pretending, she says. At school, I'd smile. I'd tell people my dad was doing great in a bid to hinder them from being overly inquisitive. But inside I was scared. Scared that one day the weight of it all would crush him. Scared that I'd come home and find he wasn't there. Karen believes that performance wasn't just for the audience as people would perceive. Performance was a form of survival, and a good way to keep the darkness at bay, if only for a while. However, even that didn't last for long. As he aged, Don Knotts slowed down. The performances became fewer. The energy faded, and with that came an even deeper isolation. Karen says he feared being forgotten. He was not too safe in himself, and his biggest fear was that without the applause, he had no value. That was the hardest thing to watch, she admits. Seeing someone who gave so much felt like he wasn't enough. Seeing someone who readily poured out his depth, but felt like he was not even doing anything at all. Even then, Karen loved him. She loved him not just for who he was to the world, but for who he was to her. He was my dad, and even when he was distant or sad or locked in his own world, I never stopped loving him. She repeated that the pain she carries is something far different from resentment. What she suffered was grief for the moments they lost to silence, the conversations that never happened, and the parts of him that stayed hidden. She felt sad for the things they could have done together but didn't, just because of the emotional distance. And that's why she's speaking now. And her speaking out is in a bid to add depth and compassion to his reputation and legacy, not to tarnish it or make people perceive him differently. Finding her voice. For many years of her life, Karen Knotts was known as the daughter of the famous performer known as Knott. Nobody knew her as a writer, actress, performer, or anything. She wasn't even known to be a goal-getter or an ambitious person. She was just under the shadow of her father's name, and for a long time she didn't even mind it at all. She didn't even care that she was covered under her father's name because he was a man so loved, valued, and respected by the public. People's eyes lit up when they heard her last name. Strangers would smile and say, "Barney Fife, that must have been amazing." And she'd smile right back, offering a polite chuckle. But deep down, it wasn't always amazing. Sometimes it felt like being trapped in a shadow too big ever to escape. "Everyone expected me to be funny," Karen says. "But what if I wasn't? What if I wanted to be serious or quiet or sad? What if I just wanted to be me? Why must I do things to please them or to get validated by them? Can't I just be myself?" Growing up in Hollywood as the child of a famous actor comes with unspoken pressure and anxiety by default. You inherit expectations before you even understand what they mean. People were assuming that Karen would follow in her father's footsteps, that she'd be a natural comedian, that she'd inherit his magic. She remembers one audition where the casting director barely glanced at her resume. He just said, "So how does it feel like having Don Knotts as a dad?" and then laughed. I hadn't even opened my mouth yet. It was frustrating. The frustration was not because she didn't love her dad, but because she didn't want to be him and didn't want people to see him in her. However, in the entertainment industry and even in her mind, her last name carried a weight she couldn't put down. I remember doing a performance once. It was a small local play in a very local setting, and it was just for the fun of it. I poured everything into that role. Afterward, I asked him what he thought. He said, "You were fine. Just fine." And it broke me. The answer I got wasn't as deep as I would have wanted it to be. Why didn't he express utmost satisfaction with my performance? Why did he say, "just fine"? This continued on and on until Karen began to find her voice and her footing in the world of relevance. It started with writing. Karen began journaling, not for an audience, but for herself alone. She documented her journey and journaled her thoughts. She wrote about her childhood, her struggles, her memories of her father, both the beautiful ones and the painful ones. And in moments like these, something powerful began to happen. As she continued, she began to discover remarkable progress in her journey. "I started hearing my own voice," she says, "not the voice that echoed my dad's, not the voice shaped by Hollywood expectations, my own." From there, she began crafting a one-woman show. Initially, it was just an idea and a way to process grief and love, but soon after, it became a living, breathing performance. It became a platform that allowed her to express herself deeply and tell the whole story, not just the glossy version that fans were expecting, but the raw and honest one that people found so difficult to believe. Healing and letting go. Karen Knotts never knew she would play a part in exposing her father's untold story to the world. She found herself doing it because she couldn't bear to conceal it for so long. Her father was a good man, well-known and well-loved. However, so many circumstances led him to become less of who he's meant to be. Life, with its quiet nudges and loud awakenings, led her to the point she is presently. And now, at the age of 71, she has learned something that most people do not figure out until much later or never at all. Healing does not come all at once. Healing is not always very smooth or sweet. Healing comes in waves, processes, steps, and silence as you tell the story that once thought would destroy you. "My whole life, I tiptoed around who my dad really was," Karen says. "I wanted to protect him, I wanted to protect myself, but silence only deepens the wounds." For many decades, the ever-resilient Karen carried the burden of being the daughter of a legend while quietly grieving the emotional distance they shared. She tried to push it down, tried to fill the void with performance, applause, even humor, just like he did. But that emptiness had a way of surfacing no matter how deep she buried it. "People still talk about my dad as if he was just the funny guy on TV," she says, "and I get it. That's what he presented to the world, but I sincerely think that he deserved to be known in full. Not just the laughs, but heartbreak too. He shouldn't masquerade as someone who has a life that is completely settled and has everything figured out. He should be real and let the world feel his realness." Now, Karen's life has become a sort of bridge between the man the world remembers and the man she knew. And telling the truth about both has not only helped her find peace, but it's also helped others too. She has found her voice in the process. She has found herself and is willing to do everything possible to maintain her peace. After the performances of her one-woman show Tied Up in Knots, strangers would come up to her in tears. This was not because they were disappointed in Don Knotts, but because they saw themselves in her own story. People would say, "My dad was distant too. Or, my mom never said I love you either, but I know she tried. It was like they'd been waiting for someone to say it was okay to love someone who didn't love you the way you needed. Karen says that's what pushed her to keep going. Not his fame, nor the amount of money he had, but the connection that they shared, the love that bonded them, the realness and openness that existed between them. Real human connection and affection. Karen is now a very strong woman. She doesn't even find reasons to hold back or any restrictions whatsoever whenever she talks about her father's health. The shame and guilt have faded, and now all that remains is compassion. She feels a deep compassion for him. She feels he didn't deserve the low self-confidence and lack of self that he experienced. He suffered a lot. I mean, there's just no better way to even say it, she explains. He carried anxiety like a second skin. It was always there. He couldn't take it off. And because of that, he missed a lot of joy. She wishes things had been different. Wishes he'd felt safe enough to ask for help. Wishes therapy had been more acceptable in his time. She wished they had talked more, hugged more, said the things that needed saying before it was too late. But she's also come to terms with the fact that not everything gets tied up with a neat bow. Some things just don't get fixed, she says. Some people leave this world with their hearts still hurting, and that's the awful truth. Yet there's a strange kind of peace in acknowledging that, in letting go of the fantasy that it could have been perfect.
What those characters were like meeting them in person and how...
I think we're told that family should feel a certain way, she says. But sometimes it doesn't. And that doesn't mean it wasn't love. It just means it was imperfect love, messy love, quiet love. And that's still worth something. Karen begins to remember the last days of her father's life, the days when it became really obvious that he had come to the climax of life and death were beginning to weigh on him. Don Knotts passed away in the year 2006, and he was 81 years old at the time. At his death, the world was already beginning to treat him as a relic, for he had brought so much joy, entertainment, refreshment, and happiness to mankind. He was tired, she says, but he never lost that sparkle in his eye. Even in the hospital, he'd crack a joke just to make the nurses smile and be encouraged. She visited him often, almost always, morning, noon, and night. There's some days that she had to sleep over at his place in the hospital. In those final days, she sat by his bedside and held his hand. And sometimes they had the opportunity to talk at length. Sometimes they would just sit in silence, something they had both grown accustomed to over the years. There was no free flow of communication between them at all. There were things I still wanted to say, she admits, but I think he knew. I think we both knew. There was love there, even if we didn't say all the words. Karen shares a moment that still lives vividly in her heart. She continues to perform, write, speak, and encourage others to share their own stories, to peel back the layers and let go of shame, and most of all, to embrace the people that they love, even when that love comes in complicated forms. I don't want people to feel like they have to choose, she says, because you cannot truly love someone and still grieve what you didn't get from them. That's not betrayal. That's being human. In the end, Karen says the awful truth isn't really about her father's struggles, but the silence that surrounded those struggles. The silence that kept him and so many others from healing. This was one thing that one can learn from the lives of Don Knotts and his daughter Karen. If he had felt safe enough to open up, who knows what might have changed, she says. Maybe he would have laughed more freely, slept better, and loved even deeper. As she sits now to reflect on the entire situation from the beginning of her life to this day, surrounded by old photos, dusty scripts, and memories that still sting in both the best and worst ways, Karen Knotts doesn't see a broken legacy. She doesn't even see it the way most people think it is. She sees a full story, the kind that holds everything, the applause and the anxiety, the jokes and the silence, the love and the longing, just everything. I used to wish my story was different, she says, but now I know very well that this was the story I was meant to tell, and I'm super proud of it. I'm proud of him. I'm proud of myself. Having watched the lives of the legendary Donald Knotts and his daughter Karen Knotts, do you think there's a better way Don should have handled his situation instead of letting depression eat him up? What do you think about Karen's life and her reactions to the situations that surrounded her? I'd like you to share your thoughts in the comments. Remember to hit the like button and subscribe. Before you go, click on the video displayed on your screen.